He fixed broken bikes for free. Then someone fixed something for him. The bike was missing a wheel, a seat, and any reason to be noticed, but Tom noticed it anyway. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. It was leaned up against the dumpster behind Nolan's Market. Rusted chain, bent frame, handlebar grip half chewed through. Probably dropped there after a bad fall or a worse day. Most people would have walked past it. Most people had. Tom didn't. He stood over it for a minute, hands in the pockets of his jacket, thinking. Then he picked it up slowly and wheeled it to his truck. The back tire dragged the whole way. He didn't mind. Back at home, he pulled the garage door open. The inside smelled like old tools and cold cement. Nothing fancy. Just a workbench, some pegboard, a few labeled jars with screws and bolts sorted by size. The kind of place where things got fixed. He set the bike on the rack and looked it over. It was bad, but not hopeless. Tom worked slowly, cleaned the chain, pulled the back wheel from a box of spares he kept in the corner, replaced the seat with one he found at a yard sale 2 summers ago, took his time truing the front rim. He didn't use music, just let the work fill the silence. It took most of the day. When he finished, he stood back and gave it a final once-over. It wasn't perfect. The paint was chipped, the pedals didn't match, but it rode smooth. That was enough. The next morning, he loaded it back into the truck and drove to the community center. He parked near the basketball court and leaned the bike against the fence, tied a small note to the handlebar. Free if you need it. T. Then he got back in the truck and drove home. He didn't tell anyone, didn't wait around to see who took it. By the next afternoon, it was gone. He didn't think much of it, just went on with his week. Walks to the diner, morning coffee in the garage. He didn't expect it to become a thing. But then, a few days later, another bike showed up. It was smaller. Blue frame, missing a chain, front tire flat, propped against his mailbox like someone had left it there on purpose. Tom stood over it for a moment, then wheeled it into the garage. He fixed that one too. Word got around, though no one said anything out loud. A quiet system started to form. Bikes appeared in the early morning or after dark, always left with no note, just need. Tom didn't ask questions. He fixed what he could, left each bike leaning against the same fence at the community center, always with the same tag, free if you need it. By the end of the first month, he'd repaired 6. He kept a small notebook in the drawer next to his wrench set, not for names, just for parts used. What needed ordering, which tools were wearing down. His neighbors noticed. A few honked when they saw him working out front. Some just waved. One woman stopped while walking her dog. Said, "I think I saw one of your bikes on Elm Street. Kid riding it like it was brand new." Tom just nodded. He didn't do it for the thanks. He did it because fixing something made sense. Because for a few hours it gave him purpose. A clear problem. A clear solution. The kind of math that doesn't change with age or noise or time. The bikes kept coming. And Tom kept fixing. Not because anyone asked, but because someone had to. Tom never made a sign. Never told the neighborhood kids to drop their broken bikes by. But they came anyway. It started with one on a Tuesday. Left under the edge of his carport. Chain snapped. Back tire loose. He fixed it by Thursday, set it beside the sidewalk, and by that evening it was gone. The next week there were 2. After that they came regularly, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes late enough he'd hear the soft thud of rubber on concrete as someone rolled it up in the dark. Nobody ever knocked. Nobody asked. Tom didn't need them to. He kept a routine. Up by 6, coffee by the window, read the paper, not because he needed the news, but because it filled the quiet. Then into the garage. The tools were always in the same place. Pegboard neatly arranged. Every wrench where it belonged. He liked it that way. The bikes came in all shapes and sizes. Kids' bikes. Mountain bikes. One had a basket with faded stickers peeling off. Another had training wheels, bent from someone leaning too hard to one side. Each one was different. But they all had the same look. Used, worn down, maybe forgotten for a while. Tom didn't throw anything out. If a part couldn't be saved, he set it aside anyway. You never knew what might come in handy later. He had a drawer just for pedals, another for brake cables, an old coffee can full of reflectors and handlebar grips. He didn't rush, took his time, cleaned everything before reassembling it. Some jobs took an hour, others stretched into days. He didn't mind. The work gave him something steady. By the middle of October, the neighbors started to notice in a different way. One morning, he stepped out to find a brown paper bag on his porch. Inside was a 6-pack of root beer and a short note. "Thanks for helping my son." He didn't stop riding his bike all day. No name, just a folded scrap of paper. He read it once and tucked it in his back pocket. That same week, someone left a bundle of rags and a new set of Allen keys on the bench beside his garage. He added them to his tool set without saying anything. He didn't talk about the bikes at the diner or down at the hardware store. If someone asked, he'd just say he liked to keep busy. That was true, but it was more than that. Tom had worked as a mechanic for most of his life, spent decades under hoods and behind counters, explaining repairs to people who didn't want to hear how long it would take or how much it would cost. He was good at it, but it had always been about someone else's schedule, someone else's urgency. This was different. No deadlines, no bills, just problems he could fix one at a time. Most afternoons, he'd finish one bike and push it to the sidewalk. Then he'd sit on the bench just outside the garage and drink something cold. He didn't wait for anyone to come pick it up. But sometimes, he caught a glimpse. A boy with 2 big shoes. A girl in a hoodie pulled up over her face. A father loading it into the back of a truck without a word. Tom never waved, never asked for a thank you, just nodded, quietly, to himself. That night, he walked back into the garage, closed the door, and turned off the light. Another bike was already waiting for tomorrow. The note was tied to the handlebars with a shoelace. Tom found it early, just after his first cup of coffee. The bike had been dropped off sometime in the night. It was a kid's model. Red frame, 1 pedal missing, the back brake hanging loose like a broken arm. He wheeled it into the garage without noticing the note at first. He was halfway through removing the front tire when he saw the corner of paper tucked beneath the grip. He pulled it loose and unfolded it. "Thanks. You didn't just fix the bike. You fixed my week. No name, no date, just that." Tom stared at it for a while, then folded it back up and slid it into the drawer next to his screwdrivers. He didn't mention it to anyone. The repairs went like usual. New pedal from the parts bin, adjusted the brake tension, oiled the chain. The rear tire had a slow leak. He patched it and let it sit overnight, just to be sure. By noon the next day, the bike was back outside. It was gone before dinner. Tom didn't need to know who had written the note. He didn't recognize the handwriting, and he didn't try to guess. That wasn't the point. Still, something about it stayed with him. The next morning, he opened the drawer again and read it one more time. Just looked at it. Then he closed the drawer and went back to work. That week, 3 more bikes came in, one with a busted gear system, another with a warped rim that had clearly been ridden hard through a curb. The third was just a frame and handlebars, no wheels at all. Tom started with the easiest one and lined the others up by the wall. He didn't have to rush. There was no schedule. Each repair followed the same rhythm. Strip it down, clean it, replace what needed replacing, adjust what could be saved, test it, tune it, then leave it out front when it was ready. He kept the work simple, kept the garage clean. That Friday, it rained hard. He didn't open the garage door, just worked with it down, a small radio playing quietly on the bench behind him. Static and old music. At one point he paused and looked at the bikes waiting by the wall. He didn't know where they came from. Not really. They just kept showing up, always with a story he didn't hear, always with a reason he didn't need to know. And that was fine. That weekend, another note showed up, this one tucked under the doormat, a crumpled receipt folded into quarters with a few words scribbled in pencil. You helped more than you know. He didn't save that one, just read it once and tossed it in the trash. Not because it didn't matter, because he didn't want it to start feeling like a scoreboard. He wasn't doing this to collect gratitude. He was doing it because some things needed fixing, and some people didn't know where to go to get that done. Tom cleaned the wrench in his hand and went back to the third bike, the one with no wheels. He remembered an old mountain bike frame he'd scrapped months ago that might have the right size tires. He headed to the shed out back, unlocked the door, and started digging through the stacks. When he found what he was looking for, he carried the tires back to the garage, dusted them off, and set them beside the frame. That night the radio played until long after dark, and Tom kept working. Tom noticed the boy before the boy said anything. It was mid-morning, mid-week, one of those cool fall days when the light comes in soft and the garage feels warmer than it should. Tom was working on a pink bike with a loose headset when he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. The boy stood at the edge of the driveway, hoodie pulled up, hands in his pockets, not moving, just watching. Tom didn't say anything, just kept working. A few minutes later he looked up. The boy was still there. "You need something?" Tom asked. The boy shook his head. Tom nodded once, then went back to the headset. The bolts were stripped. He'd have to replace them. After a few more minutes, the boy stepped closer. Still didn't speak. Just watched. Quiet, but steady. Tom reached over to the workbench and grabbed a wrench. "Want to hand me that screwdriver?" he said, pointing with his chin. The boy picked it up and held it out. Tom took it, nodded again, then kept working. They didn't talk much. The next day the boy came back, same time, same spot. Tom didn't ask questions, just nodded again and kept going. This time he handed the boy a rag. "Wipe that chain down," he said. The boy didn't hesitate. He came back the day after that, and the next. He never said his name, but after a week, Tom asked. "Luis," the boy said. Tom nodded. "I'm Tom." That was all they needed. From then on, Luis showed up most mornings after school drop-off and stayed until lunch. He didn't say much, didn't fidget, just worked. Tom showed him how to patch tubes, how to check brakes, how to tell when a rim was too far gone to save. He learned fast. Sometimes they worked in silence. Other times, the small radio on the shelf played old country songs, and Luis would nod along like he'd heard them before. Tom didn't ask why he was there. Luis didn't offer. It didn't matter. They started working like a team. Luis would line up the bikes in the order they arrived. He'd prep the tools without being asked. He started labeling the tires with chalk to track repairs. One afternoon, Tom watched him adjusting a brake cable and realized he hadn't said a word all morning. Luis didn't need direction anymore. Just space. Just the work. That night, Tom sat at the table with his usual cup of tea. He thought about all the years he'd spent fixing things alone, not because he wanted to, just because there hadn't been anyone around. Now there was, and he hadn't even seen it coming. The next morning he found a note on the bench. Not from Luis, from someone else. "Who's the new guy?" "He's good. No name. just the question. Tom smiled to himself and slipped the note into the drawer with the others. Luis showed up 5 minutes later, as usual. Tom didn't mention the note, just handed him a wheel with a busted spoke and said, "Let's see what you can do." Luis sat down without a word and got to work. That day they fixed 4 bikes. Didn't keep count, didn't take a photo, just lined them up outside and went back inside to clean up. The routine was simple, but something about it felt like it was starting to matter more than either of them had said out loud. They were finishing up a kid's mountain bike when Luis finally asked. It was early afternoon. The sun had just started to slip behind the edge of the garage. The day had been quiet, just the usual hum of the radio, the occasional rattle of a socket wrench, and the soft sound of Luis wiping down the frame with a clean cloth. Tom had just tightened the last bolt on the back tire when he heard it. "Why do you do this for free?" Luis didn't look up when he asked, just kept cleaning the frame. Tom didn't answer right away. He stood slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked over to the workbench. He poured a little more coffee from the thermos he kept out there, took a sip. Then he said, "Because someone once helped me when I didn't have anything." Luis nodded a little, like he was still listening but didn't need more. Tom didn't add anything else. It wasn't a story he liked to tell. It wasn't dramatic. No big turning point. Just a moment years ago when someone gave him something without asking for anything back. A job when he had no references. A set of tools when his were stolen. A warm meal when he'd been too proud to ask. Small things, but they stayed. So now he fixed bikes. Quietly. Without a price. Without needing to explain. Luis didn't push the conversation further. He finished cleaning the bike, checked the brakes one last time, and rolled it to the edge of the driveway. By the time he turned back, Tom had already pulled the next one onto the rack. That was how they worked. The question hung in the air for a few more minutes, then faded, replaced by cables and spokes and the kind of focus that doesn't need noise. That evening, after Luis left, Tom stood in the garage and looked around. There were 5 bikes waiting by the wall, 3 mid-repair, 2 already finished and tagged with small notes in his usual block handwriting. Chain replaced, brakes tight, ready to ride. He picked up a spare pedal and turned it over in his hand. He hadn't planned for any of this. At first it had just been something to do, a way to stay busy. But it was turning into something else now. Not a job, not a mission, just a steady pattern of effort that had started to build something under the surface. Trust, routine, connection. He pulled open the drawer next to the workbench, the one with the notes. He smoothed them out, read a few. The writing was all different. Slanted, neat, messy. One was written in crayon. They weren't thank yous. Not really. They were just acknowledgments. People letting him know that the work mattered, that they'd noticed. He added a new one to the pile. Folded paper. One sentence from Luis, written in pencil the week before. "This one's better than new." He slipped it into the drawer and closed it. The garage was quiet again. Tom turned off the light, locked the door, and walked back into the house. The next morning, Luis was already waiting when Tom stepped outside, hands in his pockets, same hoodie, same nod. Tom didn't say good morning, just held the garage door open and said, "We've got a lot to do." Luis smiled once, just barely. Then they got to work. Winter showed up early that year. Tom woke to frost on the windows and a wind that cut sideways through his coat before he even made it to the end of the driveway. The sky was heavy. The forecast had said light flurries, but snow was already gathering on the edges of the sidewalk. He opened the garage and let the cold spill in. The air smelled like rubber and metal, and the start of a season that didn't leave much room for standing still. Luis arrived 10 minutes later, Hoodie pulled up tight, sleeves shoved into his jacket. He didn't say anything, just gave a nod and stepped inside. They didn't work on bikes that morning. Instead, Tom pulled everything off the wall: hooks, bins, jars, the rack they'd built from scrap wood back in August. The garage needed space. The weather had made that decision for them. Luis followed his lead. No complaints, no questions. They swept the floor, cleared off the workbench, reorganized the spare parts into labeled bins Tom had saved from his shop years ago. Chains, tubes, brakes, cables, seats. Tom had been through enough winters to know what it did to metal. How cold could freeze the grease out of a bearing. How water turned bolts brittle. How time slowed everything down. He didn't like rushing repairs, so he didn't. They finished clearing the garage by lunch. Then Tom pulled out 2 camp chairs and a thermos of soup he'd brought out from the house. Luis sat without being asked. They ate quietly, steam rising between them. "We'll pause on the big jobs," Tom said. "At least for a while." Luis nodded. "But we'll get the small stuff ready. Clean chains, patch tubes. Make sure when spring comes, we're not starting from zero." Luis took another spoonful of soup and gave a small smile. It wasn't disappointment on his face. It was understanding. That afternoon, they started on the unfinished pile. Tom took apart a coaster brake hub that had been giving him trouble. Luis worked on organizing the handlebars by size and condition. They moved slow but steady. By the end of the day, everything in the garage had a place. Nothing sat on the floor. Nothing felt forgotten. Before he left, Luis walked to the garage door, stopped, and looked back. "You going to be out here tomorrow?" Tom glanced at the sky. More snow coming. Maybe ice. "Probably not," he said. "But I'll keep the side door unlocked. If you want to come in, work on anything." Luis nodded. "I will." Then he stepped out into the cold and disappeared down the street. That night, Tom sat by the window with a blanket over his lap and the garage key on the table beside him. He didn't worry about the bikes. They were inside, covered, ready. He thought about winters past, ones that felt longer, ones where there wasn't anyone coming by to help, ones where the cold settled into the walls and didn't let go. This year felt different, not because the cold had changed, but because something else had filled the space around it. Trust, effort, company. Tom got up, walked to the front door, and flipped the porch light on. Then he turned off the rest of the house and went to bed. The next morning, there was already a dusting of snow on the ground, and the garage door was still locked. But inside, on the workbench, Luis had left a note. "Cleaned and sorted. We'll finish the rest tomorrow. L." The driveway stayed empty for 5 days. Tom's foot had slipped on the front steps while he was carrying a box of brake cables from the garage to the house. One wrong angle, one fast fall. He hit the ground hard and stayed there for a moment longer than he wanted to admit. The neighbor found him, called the ambulance. He didn't argue. The doctor said it was a hip fracture. Not the worst kind, but not nothing either. He'd need time. A walker. Maybe physical therapy if he wanted full movement back. Tom didn't say much, just nodded. He stayed at the hospital for 2 nights, then got discharged with a bag of papers and a bottle of pills. A volunteer helped him get into his house. He shuffled slowly from room to room with the walker in front of him like a new set of handlebars he didn't want. The garage stayed closed. He didn't open it. Didn't even look at it. He knew what was waiting inside. Unfinished bikes, loose parts, tools out of reach. A dozen things he couldn't do with one bad hip and no real timeline. He spent his days at the kitchen table watching the light change on the walls. The first day, no one came by. The second day, someone left a takeout container on the porch. No note. The third day, Luis knocked. Just once. Tom called out, "Come in," and Luis stepped inside. He looked around, spotted the walker, and didn't ask questions. "You okay?" "Getting there," Tom said. Luis didn't stay long, just said he'd be back to check in later. Asked if Tom needed anything. Tom wanted to say yes. Tools. Help. A pair of hands in the garage. But he said no. The fourth day, it snowed again. Tom stayed in his chair, rubbing the side of his leg, listening to the radio play something soft and slow. He wondered how many bikes had piled up outside. Wondered if anyone noticed the driveway was empty. Wondered if the work they'd done so quietly had meant anything now that it had stopped. The fifth day, he heard the noise. It started as a low clank, a wrench hitting concrete, then a voice. 2, maybe 3. Laughter. The sound of a bike stand being opened. Tom pulled himself up, steadied on the walker, and shuffled toward the window. The garage door was open. Inside were 6 kids, including Luis. They weren't standing around. They were working. Luis was at the bench, pulling a chain through a degreaser bath. Another kid, maybe 10, 12, was sorting through a bin of petals. Someone else was patching a tube on the ground. Tom opened the front door slowly, stepped out, and called across the yard. "What's going on out here?" Luis looked up, smiled a little. "Had a few bikes drop off. Figured we'd get a head start." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You have a key?" "Nope," Luis said. "Window wasn't locked." Tom grunted. "Guess I'll fix that." He made his way across the lawn, slow, careful. The cold air bit into his face, but he didn't mind. The sound of the garage, tools, voices, work, was louder than the cold. When he reached the door, he leaned against the frame and looked around. It wasn't perfect. Tools out of place. A cable routed wrong. One kid hammering when he should have been twisting. But they were trying. And they were doing it because they'd seen it done before. Tom didn't say much, just nodded toward Luis. "Thanks," he said. Luis shrugged. "You fixed a lot of bikes." He didn't say the rest out loud, but Tom heard it anyway. Now it was their turn. Tom stepped inside, leaned the walker against the bench, and sat down on the old stool he hadn't used in years. He didn't grab a tool. Not yet. He just watched them work. The garage light hadn't worked in years. The bulb over the workbench had burned out some time back, and Tom had never bothered to replace it. He'd always worked with the side lamp and the overhead fluorescents. It was enough. He didn't need much light to see what was broken. But that morning, as he stepped into the garage with his cane in one hand and his coffee in the other, he flipped the old switch out of habit. And the light came on. Bright. Clear. Clean. He stared at it for a moment, then looked around the garage. Everything had been rearranged. The tools were in the right place, just straighter. The wrenches lined up by size, the parts bins stacked instead of scattered. The bench had been wiped clean, and someone had left a folded towel next to a bottle of chain lube. There was even a box of new rags on the shelf, still sealed. Tom didn't ask who did it. He didn't need to. That afternoon, Luis showed up with 2 more kids. One of them was carrying a back wheel with a shredded tire. The other had a hand-me-down bike that rattled when it moved. Tom didn't ask where they came from. He just pointed to the rack. "Let's get started." They worked for 2 hours. Tom couldn't do everything yet. His hips still ached if he stood too long, but he could sit on the stool and handle the detail work. Tighten brake levers, thread cables, show the youngest one how to patch a tube without tearing the edge. At one point, someone handed him a screwdriver without being asked. He didn't even have to look up. The rhythm was back. By the end of the day, 2 bikes were finished. One was still missing a seat, but they added it to the list. Tom sat at the edge of the bench and looked around the room. The floor was swept, the tools were clean, and the light that hadn't worked in years still burned overhead. Luis was loading parts back into a bin when Tom spoke. "You fix that light?" Luis shook his head. "I didn't, but someone did." Tom nodded. It didn't matter who. It just mattered that someone had cared enough to do it. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his old notebook, the one he used to track repairs, parts, and what each bike had needed. He flipped to a fresh page. Garage updates. Light fixed. Tools reorganized. Need more brake pads. Ask Luis about the socket set. He closed the notebook and set it beside the coffee maker for the next morning. Then he walked back out to the garage one last time. The air was cold, but the light inside was warm. He stepped through the doorway and stood for a long minute just listening. No sound. No work happening right now. But the place didn't feel still. It felt ready. He reached for the light switch and paused, then left it on. Because sometimes it's not about what gets fixed. It's about who shows up when something breaks. And this time, someone had shown up for him. It started with one bike and ended with a garage full of names he never asked for. Tom stood at the workbench with a wrench in hand and a knee that still didn't bend like it used to. Across from him, Luis was tightening a derailleur on a 10-speed that had clearly been ridden hard and put away wet. Another kid, Zoe, he'd learned her name 2 weeks ago, was sorting spare parts into bins without being asked. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The system worked. Bikes came in. Bikes went out. Some were dropped off with notes. Others just appeared, parked by the curb or leaned against the old wood fence. Sometimes they were missing parts. Sometimes they were barely more than frames. It didn't matter. They fixed what they could. That morning, Tom had found a folded piece of paper stuck under the garage door. "Thanks for the red one. My brother rides it to work now. Saves us 2 bus fares a week." He read it once, then added it to the drawer. The notes didn't come every day, but they came often enough to remind him that the work mattered, that it had reached beyond his yard, beyond the neighborhood. He still didn't ask for names, still didn't take credit. But now, people waved when they passed by. Some dropped off tools. Others left coffee or donuts. One woman brought a stack of towels and said, "You'll probably use these more than I do." She wasn't wrong. The light in the garage kept working. So did Tom. He couldn't do it all like he used to. The ladder was off limits now. So were the long days. But he'd adjusted. Luis and the others handled the heavy lifting. He focused on what his hands still knew how to do: measure, align, repair. That afternoon, Zoe finished a tune-up on a green bike with mismatched wheels. She wheeled it to the driveway, propped it against the fence, and wiped her hands on the towel. Tom looked it over. "Good work." She gave a quick nod. "Think it'll hold up?" "Only one way to find out." 5 minutes later, a kid showed up to claim it. Couldn't have been older than 10. No words. Just a quiet smile as he took the handlebars and pedaled away. Tom watched him until he turned the corner, then turned back to the garage. Luis was already pulling the next frame from the wall. Zoe was reloading the bin of cables. The work didn't stop. That evening, after the last bike had been rolled out and the last tool hung on its hook, Tom stayed behind while the others packed up. The light overhead cast a steady glow across the workbench. He reached into the drawer and pulled out the first note he'd ever received. "Thanks. You didn't just fix the bike. You fixed my week." He read it again. The words were still simple, still quiet, but they carried weight. He slid the note back into the drawer and closed it gently. Then he picked up his notebook and turned to a blank page. Next week. Replace inner tubes. Check inventory. Look at donation frame from Elm Street. Ask Luis about running a workshop for younger kids. Try standing longer. See how the hip holds up. He closed the notebook and turned off the radio. He didn't need applause, didn't want it. The bikes kept coming. The kids kept showing up. And the light, finally, stayed on. Not because he fixed it, but because someone else did. And for Tom, that was enough to know he wasn't doing this alone anymore. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.